Tim, and let me say from the outset that it's a great thrill to be here and to congratulate Tim and the Australian Taxpayers Alliance for putting on the Friedman conference. I mentioned before over at lunch that I've been to several conferences like this in New York and Washington and London and even in Europe, and this is right up there. So you've done very well in such a short period of time, so more power to you and the Australian Libertarian Society. I want to thank Jason. Thank you all for being here. I have noticed that in the course of the last 2 or so days how many young people are here at this conference, millennials. And I commiserate with a lot of millennials because, you know, you're going out into the world with not one but many predictions of doom and gloom hovering over you. Global warming, nuclear proliferation, collapse of global capitalism, poverty, energy crisis, exploding population, populism, Trump, Brexit, all this doom and gloom you all too often hear, that things are getting really bad, that the world is deteriorating at a rapid rate. And I think the problem with that argument is lack of evidence and statistics. Because by any criteria, the world has become a better place. This point has been made many times in the course of the last few years by some esteemed commentators. Matthew Ridley from the House of Lords, who writes for the Times and the Spectator magazine. The Harvard economist Steven Pinker. Kishore Mahbubani, the distinguished Singaporean intellectual and former diplomat. Johan Norberg, prominent Swedish intellectual. And they make the point. Poverty, sanitation, malnutrition, literacy, child labour, infant mortality, by any criteria, life has improved dramatically for the broad cross-sections of human beings. 2 centuries ago, 94% of people lived on $2 a day in real terms, in real constant dollars. 94% of humans lived on $2 a day. Today, only 10% do. In the early 1980s, 9 in 10 Chinese people on the mainland lived in extreme poverty. Today, just 1 in 10 do. That's all in the course of 30 to 40 years. It's extraordinary progress. And since Soviet communism collapsed in 89, 91, extreme poverty across the globe has decreased from 37% to 10%. In 2000, the United Nations announced several Millennium Development Goals, and one was to halve the amount of people living in extreme poverty by 2015. By 2008, at the halfway point, that target, to too little media fanfare, was met. Half the people were cut in half. That's extraordinary. The number of people in extreme poverty cut by 2008, not 2015. In 1990, the average life expectancy on the planet was, what? 31 years. Today, it's 71 years. So it's increased 40 years for life expectancy for average humans in more than a century. It's extraordinary progress. Some of you are too young to remember this, but in the 1970s, prominent Greens were fretting and wavering about overpopulation and mass starvation. I was born in 1971, and there were roughly 3.76 billion people in the world. How many are there today? There are 7.63 billion people. Now, throughout the 1970s, several distinguished thinkers alleged that such a huge growth in population would amount to the collapse of civilization. Now, as it happens, this month marks the 50th anniversary of what I would argue is the greatest environmental scaremongering book published of the modern era. And it was Paul Ehrlich's book called The Population Bomb. It was published in May 1968. It sold 3 million copies within a few months. Extraordinary. Highly popular. And his argument began. This was the beginning of his book on page 1. Quote, "The battle to feed humanity is over. In the 1970s, the world will undergo famines. Hundreds of millions of people will starve to death." Now, Ehrlich, who was an ecologist and biologist at Stanford University, he set out possible scenarios of doom and gloom. And he supported this with what he called evidence. India would be doomed in the next generation. England would disappear by the year 2000. The US life expectancy would drop to 42 years by 1980. The threat of population explosion was settled science. This became the orthodoxy among not just the environmental calamitists, but also the editorial writers at the distinguished newspapers like The Guardian and the New York Times. In 1970, the Harvard biologist George Wald warned, quote, "Civilization will end within 15 or 30 years unless immediate action is taken against problems facing mankind." In 1972, the Club of Rome issued a statement called The Limits to Growth, and it predicted that the 5 resources, tin, gold, mercury, silver, and oil, would be gone within 2 decades. Robert Mcnamara, the former Defence Secretary in the Johnson and Kennedy administrations, was a World Bank president in the 1970s, and he argued, quote, "Rampant population growth is akin to thermonuclear holocaust." And this justified, according to Mcnamara, throwing development dollars at state-mandated population control. And again, this was the overwhelming orthodoxy, not just at Harvard University, but across the enlightened classes around the world. Even Richard Nixon, the President of the United States from 69 to 74, indulged in a lot of this hysteria in the, I think it was 73 and 74 State of the Union addresses. In 1975, the Environment Fund published full-page advertisements warning the world as we know it will likely be ruined by the year 2000. Now, needless to say, none of this came to pass. Human ingenuity, economic growth, technological progress, it all saved the day. Modern farming techniques, this was known as the Green Revolution, and it included an expansion of irrigation and use of fertilisers and pesticides, what many Greens denounce as unfriendly towards the environment. This caused both reliable harvests and spectacular output. As a result, things have clearly got a lot better around the world, particularly in the developing world, by almost any measure. Life expectancy, infant mortality, literacy, access to clean water. Food became more abundant and more affordable. Now, material progress isn't everything. Jonah Goldberg, a prominent conservative in Washington, has just written a book called The Suicide of the West, and he just highlights in great detail that rapes, deaths by violence and disease, slavery, torture, they've all declined massively, while rights for women, gays, minorities and the disabled have expanded dramatically. So the question here is, why do so many people, particularly millennials, think that things are getting so bad, getting worse? Well, simply put, I think bad news sells. Jono Norberg from Sweden was on my radio program on, of all places, the ABC late last year, and he made the point that we find stories about things going wrong far more interesting than stories about things going well. Just take Ebola. 2014, 2015, the epidemic claimed thousands of lives in Africa and spread as far as the United States. We all knew about this. Huge story. And when the virus exposed the failures of the world public health system, everyone knew about it. But did you know that in the past year, researchers have found a 100% effective vaccine that could help save lives in a future epidemic of the deadly disease? I mean, this is great progress, but how many people know about it? Take energy. When President Trump pulled the United States out of the Paris Climate Accords nearly a year ago, he was overwhelmingly slammed for hurting the environment. And yet, US emissions are coming down faster than much of Europe. Little known fact. Indeed, the US is on the cusp of being energy independent for the first time in nearly 5 decades. And how do we account for this? It's not because of carbon taxes or emissions trading, cap and trade schemes or regulations. It's primarily because of a thing called fracking, a free market revolution, the Shale Gas Revolution. Look at the environment. Advanced nations have set higher standards, which in turn have contributed to cleaner air, land and water. Sure, natural disasters, they still wreak havoc. But as nations grow richer, we will be better able to handle damage wrought by nature. I would argue that nowhere is the prosperity more evident than in this country. If you go back to the early to mid-1980s, Australia was bogged down by big government, union militancy, red tape and regulations. Keynesianism was the orthodoxy. Well, next month marks the 27th year of uninterrupted growth for the Australian economy. It's a world record in the OECD. Why? I would argue it's the same explanation that accounts for the dramatically improved living standards in the developing world. Capitalism, free markets. It was Bob Hawke and Paul Keating, Labor guys, who deregulated the economy. And those policies more or less existed under John Howard and Peter Costello. Some setbacks, obviously, but all things considered, that period from 1983 when Bob Hawke was elected right through to the end of Howard in 2007 coincided with our record bull run. And that's why we've had primarily a good run. Which brings us back to Ehrlich, whose neo-Malthusian predictions about overpopulation and mass starvation and dramatically declining living standards and life expectancies has been proven spectacularly wrong. Ehrlich, as it happens, turns 85 on Tuesday. He turns 85 when he said that by 1980 the average life expectancy in the United States would be 47. And he's still peddling doom and gloom. And guess what? He's still revered. Even though he lost a famous bet in 1980 that the prices of the 5 resources would rise in the next decade. In an interview with the Guardian newspaper just last March, this was 2 months ago, he warned, "Thanks to overpopulation and overconsumption, the collapse of civilization is a near certainty within decades." However, if you detest capitalism, as people of Ehrlich's ilk clearly do, it's all too appealing to read an impending apocalypse into every public policy challenge that our market economy faces. Now, in conclusion, I'm not a Pollyanna. I'm optimistic about the future, but I recognise that a thing called the end of history is just not possible. China and Russia, we were told in the late 80s and early 1990s, the more they became capitalist and embraced market economics, they become democratic. It clearly hasn't happened. And I don't think that democracy is an export commodity. I think democracy is an essentially do-it-yourself enterprise that requires special circumstances and conditions, which is one of the reasons why sound conservatives oppose the war in Iraq. But the point here is that despite the gloomy headlines, never has there been less hunger, less disease, more prosperity and security around the world. And my advice to millennials, and I saw a few of them the other night at the drink session, I told them, cheer up, ignore the alarmists, assess the evidence and recognise that technological progress, markets and innovation and economic growth have made our lives much better than we all too often realise. Thank you very much.
And now we have Speaker Jason Potts.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Tom. So I want to pick up on some of the sort of aspects that Tom has mentioned and sort of dig down into them. Now, I'm an economist. I specialise in economics of new technology, so I'm just going to focus on the area that I know. So we may or may not have slides with this. It's right. The thing I want to focus on here is why do we care about? I mean, the case for optimism here is really about why it comes down to why we can trust the growth of knowledge or the production of new technology, and how that will grow. The argument for why we care about wealth is that wealth is the basic material condition for prosperity and human flourishing. What we have learnt in economics is that the overwhelming cause of growth in wealth is new technology. Now, new technology understood very broadly, not just new technology in the sense of physical technology, but also new technology in the sense of institutional technology and other sort of aspects of causes of increase in trade and new tech. Now, the question I want to look at here is not so much where does wealth come from. We know the answer to that broadly. It's new knowledge. The question is, where does new knowledge come from? And the sort of classical libertarian case for optimism is that we've actually got a fairly good understanding of where new knowledge comes from, the new knowledge that then subsequently drives wealth. And the answer to that is basically a set of classical liberal institutions. These are property rights, these are market institutions, these are just the set of institutions that enables search and discovery of new technologies. And that's the surprising, interesting point with this, is this that the answer to the question, where does new technology come from or new knowledge come from, is not experts. It's not research laboratories. That's where new invention comes from. Invention doesn't create value. It creates the potential for value to subsequently be created. The growth in human wealth and flourishing and the rise of the growth of economies is the process by which those initial new ideas or possibilities or technical seeds or inventions are subsequently explored and possibilities for value creation are opened up. Now, the key thing to understand is it's not engineers that do that, it's entrepreneurs that do that. That's a process that takes place in markets and requires market institutions to work for that discovery process to occur. So, I mean, this is the case for the case for optimism in relation to new technology as a source of wealth and so on is trust in the process that these market institutions are strong enough and viable enough to enable that process to happen. That's it, right? Where classical liberals tend to be optimists for technological reasons because of our sort of confidence or ability to create robust market institutions. Market institutions are where technologies come from, not research laboratories. Research laboratories are an enabling thing, but that's the key idea behind this. And it's worth sort of thinking about the history of this. Tom mentioned this in passing, that this notion that technology will save us, or there's reasons to be sort of technologically optimistic. It's not just classical liberals that believe that. Once upon a time, Marxists used to believe that as well. Right? This was the great sort of planning thing that we'll have nuclear power and we'll have the best tractors in the world, or just whatever the thing that you could imagine that you wanted, and if we get the experts onto that and fund those experts and point them in the right direction, and if they're the best experts, we will win. Right? So Techno Optimism was once the basic, that was a socialist property far more so than a market capitalist property. But what they got wrong was they misunderstood how you create value through technology. The argument, the implicit notion there was if we have the best experts and engineers, they can plan our way to a technological future of prosperity. And turned out that was wildly optimistic and tragically misguided, because that's what that effectively did was limit the space of the knowledge that is going to be combined and pulled and developed and new ideas created to the imagination of that set of engineers. And engineers are smart people, but they're not as smart as a distributed set of, they're not as smart as the entire economy. And that was the thing that was missing in this. Now, many of us sort of got a fairly intuitive sense of the sort of Hayekian arguments around how markets create process distributed information and knowledge to create efficiency and prices and so on, blah blah blah. That's the market efficiency argument. This also applies to technology, and what is being the distributed information and knowledge that markets are pooling here is distributed insight into how I can use this new idea in this particular case or this particular application. The value of technology is not invention, it's the process by which the idea is adopted and diffused into an economy. As that process happens, we get development, we get adaptation, we get reuse, we get repurposing of stuff, we get discovery. Technologies are developed in markets, not in laboratories. And therefore the case for optimism is our confidence in our ability to build a technology stack that is deep. So the mistake that the sort of Soviets, as it were, made was that they got a very shallow technology stack that was fantastic for nuclear power and missiles maybe, but there was nothing underneath it. It had no ability for that technology to then escape from those military purposes or whatever, and to find other uses to be discovered. What it turns out that a market economy has is a deep technology stack, and those technologies go all the way from just this sort of inventions around sort of in physics and engineering and so on, through to accounting technologies and legal technologies and organizational technologies and democratic technologies, and this full stack of technologies, all of which can adapt and grow and co-evolve. So this notion, this sort of understanding of this link between technologies and markets is relatively well understood by sort of good economic historians. If you want to read anyone on this, it's Joel Moykier, it's the one I would point you to. But this feedback between classical liberal market institutions, rule of law, democratic institutions, and technological discovery in markets, and all of the consequences of that. This means that sort of part of the technological apparatus of discovery also includes startup firms that fail. That's part of the discovery process. It includes the financial system that is part of that sort of process of discovery and knowledge diffusion. It includes the legal system that is backing it up and so on. And so this notion, again, the reason that classical liberals and libertarians tend to be optimists in this space is because we've got a clear sense of how this full technology stack co-evolves together, and the importance of the deep stuff here. Not just the importance of the engineers at the top or the experts at the top, but the importance of all of the institutions that sit underneath this and enable these things to co-evolve and develop. Now, what that means, the consequence of that, is that technology is essentially unpredictable. We can't tell where it's going. If we knew where it was going, that would, it's a discovery process, not an execution of a planning process. This is a generalization of the power of markets into the generalization of the discovery of new knowledge, which is why the sort of phrase that comes to mind for me is trust the process. Even if we don't know where these new technologies are going to take us. The moment we've got a sort of the latest stack of technologies around sort of the Web 3.0, Industry 4.0, sort of 5G and AI and VR and machine learning and blockchain and that sort of whole stack. Okay, we've got a bunch of inventions there. We kind of know how the algorithms work, kind of. We can speculate about the value maybe, but we have to build it and see. And that process of who builds that, this is the more that process can be distributed, the more corners that can be experimentally pushed into. That's how we're going to learn where the sources of value will come from. No one knows that in advance. Anyone who claims to know that in advance is lying to you for some strategic reason. This is a discovery process, which means that we have to, the institutions that we build have to have error correction mechanisms built into them. Mark Pennington at King's calls this robust political economy. But the point of this here is that the technological system is not just a layer of engineers on top. It's a full institutional stack that is built around the idea of knowledge discovery, adaptation, flexibility, co-evolution of these mechanisms. And this is why at the bottom of our technology stack, things like free speech, things like rule of law, things like this ability to limit the power of planning and corruption or power to concentrate in this thing is actually part of, or is a key part of the technology development process. So, I mean, that's kind of I think the argument, that's the classical liberal argument for techno optimism channeled through, as an economist sees it. But what this amounts to is an argument here that technologies are a market, technological development or knowledge development, and therefore the main thing that is driving human prosperity is actually an institutional market process. The healthier and more robust our market institutions are, the more we can be optimistic about a technological future. That's the argument. And any argument, I mean, if you think about where techno-pessimism comes from, it's everything that is the opposite of that. So this notion that a lot of, sort of indicated before, that the early sort of Soviets and whatever were very techno-optimistic until it turned out that their very shallow technology stack just didn't work because it lacked the institutional depth. The next generation of those, that sort of intellectual line went deep techno-pessimist because they couldn't imagine which engineers would solve the problem. They were looking in the wrong place. They're still looking in the wrong place. And we sort of see this, to my mind, I'm sort of picking on engineers there as a sort of figurehead for that, but what I really mean are so you now see this playing out in terms of regulators who want to imagine a technological future, unless they can see exactly where it's going and then guide that with the regulatory rails that it'll run along. That's not how we get new technologies. How we get new technologies is we build a process by which we build a discovery process. That discovery process is not done through regulatory planning. It's not done through departments of whatever. It's not really done in even research laboratories. It's done through an open market institutional process of experimentation and error correction and learning, and that's why it's always surprising. That's why you never know where things are going to come from. That's why what markets do is then provide feedback for that process. That's why this works best on a global scale. That's why this also works best when we can move resources around efficiently and effectively. That's the role of finance within this place. But classical liberal market institutions are how we build new technologies. And I think that's the argument for techno-optimism, is that we've got a deep understanding of how they work. Thank you.